I've played the entirety of Bloodborne on my computer. Yes, you heard me, the PlayStation exclusive game that's been held hostage for 9 years was on my computer. If you haven't heard yet, a group of extremely dedicated people have emulated the whole game to be played on PC, and they've done an amazing job. Starting towards the end of summer in 2024, the game was ported to PC, and within a handful of weeks, the modders have been able to help optimize it alongside the emulator to the point of being fully playable. Seeing that I've been playing through the Souls games, the opportunity to play Bloodborne was very enticing. In this video, I want to talk about the state of the emulator right now, and how playable the game is. If you're looking for help on how to get the game, I'll link some useful videos in the description, as well as the mods that I've used, but for the most part I'm not going to go over the installation in my video here. I want to tell you about the experiences I had with this game as of the time of this video, because at the rate this project is progressing, I think 60 FPS upscaled, fully optimized Bloodborne is possible within a few more months, which is really insane when you think about it. After a good 4 years of people really thinking that the game deserved a remaster, they just did it themselves within a few months. I think before I get into any talk, I should tell you what specs my PC has. I have a 4060 graphics card, an i5-12600K CPU, and 32 gigs of DDR5 RAM. And if you don't know what any of that means, you most likely cannot run this emulator with the quality I was able to. It is still probably possible with FPS boost mods, but this is at a heavy price of the graphics you would have. Getting the game was very difficult for me, because when I had originally tried it was in early September, which wasn't that long after the emulation first started. When I tried playing the game, I had to overcome a large obstacle of figuring out how to install it with very minimal help. I had to jump through hoops to get this game running, and it took me a couple of days of attempts just to figure out how to get the game installed, get it to run through the emulator, and then figure out that it was not refined enough to even try playing it. So after a good month of playing Sekiro and making the video on it, I went back to try to get it working. A month off of trying, this emulator had almost a year worth of development, because 1 month after my last attempt, the game was not only playable, it was really close to being perfect. So what issues did I run into with this emulator? Not being too specific, there were a few categories of bugs and problems I found. These were insane lag, lighting issues, entities and areas not fully loading, and of course many crashes. The biggest issue, in my opinion, that isn't the crashing because sometimes it was overwhelming, is things not loading when necessary. This sometimes led to things I didn't even realize being wrong, like the sky in Yahar Ghul missing the clouds, even though I still thought it was awesome. There were many enemies and textures throughout the game that just had a chance of not loading in, but this was mostly all fixable by exiting and reloading the save. One of the first times I really had to deal with this was the Cleric Beast, which had a decent chance to not load, leading to a funny reveal. It's not fucking loaded. On another side of the area's loading, the textures many times would either bug out and load a different texture, or would have many flickers that would probably trigger someone's epilepsy. I think some of the textures are bugging, what do you guys think? Something that could happen at random were either my character or any other enemy changing textures when hit, giving the hunter really shiny clothes or a yellow-pink getup. Some bosses were also having this issue, but this was more of a distraction than anything. Many examples of this I'm not including, because this was something I was seeing for most of the game, with some areas having more or less depending on how much the modders have put into fixing them so far. As I said earlier, this is still an in-progress adventure, so this entire issue might be resolved within a few months. Something I also noticed after the night progresses and Yharnam isn't in the sunset anymore is that there were many less overall issues, which made the early game feel way worse than the late game. This could also be because I updated some of the mods halfway through base game, which could make some things run better, but the start of the game seemed way more buggy and laggy than later on. It might also be that extra lighting from the sun putting more strain on my PC. The lighting issue was something that was mostly an issue early on in the emulator, with it being a whole issue that had to be fixed. Especially in start game Yharnam, the lighting was so overpowering that it wasn't even worth looking at the emulator yet. But that issue has been almost completely solved by now, so the problem I'm talking about now is a lot better than how it was, but it can still be annoying sometimes. Every once in a while, some areas are much darker than they are meant to be, with the main thing I had to deal with being flickering in some bosses. The main boss I can remember this being a problem was with Ludwig, to where his model was so dark that it was definitely a different feel than what was intended. But mostly the lighting wasn't that bad compared to what it started as, so props to the modders. For the lag, this was mainly only for some specific areas, and wasn't as bad as you would expect. The areas that were affected by this though ended up being some of the worst gameplay that the emulator gave me. Sometimes I didn't even know what would cause it, but loading into certain lanterns would lag my entire computer for the length of the lag. And other times the entire area would just lag exponentially until I could get away from it. The worst case of this was in Yahar Ghul, where the entire run back to the One Reborn was just fucked. And obviously the boss being the One Reborn doesn't help this be any better. Another really bad area was some parts of the Nightmare of Mensis and the Nightmare Frontier, where the lag would put me in slow-mo until I either reopened the save or moved far enough away. There wasn't too much lag throughout the game though, with it all being mostly condensed into a few really bad patches and not much else. The biggest issue by far though, which followed me through the whole playthrough, is random crashes. During some areas, certain enemies or rooms were chosen to be crash carriers like the plague. Either being hit or hitting certain enemies would crash the game, and sometimes it couldn't be avoided. Some enemies had the power to resist being reset when I reopened the game, and would always have the power to crash me. This leads to a lot of things being needed to be run past, but this was luckily something that also slowed down farther into the game. Really early parts of the playthrough had much more crashing, but there were still some outliers later on. The entire forest before Bergenworth was so terrible that I had to delete my SFX folder just so that it wouldn't insta-crash every time I loaded the lantern. There were a couple instances that I had to delete the SFX folder, which would help but not completely solve the issue. The lag could also combo with crashes and create some really bad areas, kinda playing into each other to try to halt the playthrough. Yahar Ghul in general was just bad, with me needing to delete the SFX folder to get into it, and then having bad lag and some texture issues. Really trying to ruin my day bringing everything together. The only other major issue I had with my playthrough was accessing the DLC. My journey of finding out how to get the DLC was almost as bad as getting the damn game to work. The way to get the DLC is really simple, and there's a perfect video that helped me do it, but it took me so long to figure out the issues and what was going wrong. The entire problem was caused by the fact that the emulator doesn't recognize the DLC in the game, meaning that to get it to work you need to get the game to open a specific way in the emulator to where you can access the built-in mods. From that mod menu I was able to force the DLC on, as well as some other things if I wanted to. The thing that took me near 4 days to figure out, though, was figuring out the game didn't have the DLC. So I spent many attempts beating Vicar Amelia in hopes the item would spawn, downloading different patches of the emulator and changing mods, until I found the video which I didn't even think would change anything. Like, how was I supposed to figure out that I needed the in-emulator mod list to force the DLC into the game? 4 days of trying later, I did get the DLC, and it overall had very few of the issues that I've discussed. Some of the good things though, as you've been seeing in the gameplay here, is the quality of the game that is achievable. The entire playthrough I was likely over 60 frames, except for the major lag where it dropped to 10 or less. I couldn't tell you exactly if it was 720 or 1080p, but together it feels like a normal game, and might feel a little smoother than Dark Souls 1 honestly. Also being partially held up by mods, the game is really easily moddable, which in my opinion could add in multiple different ways. Not only did the mods fix bugs and upscale some textures, but I was struggling to get the DLC. I added the Bloodborne Enhanced mod, which is just a huge quality of life mod. Just being able to get a mod like this is really nice, especially when getting it on PlayStation would be infinitely more difficult. This would be something I wouldn't expect every person to want or need in their playthrough, but I found some good uses. This is almost like the dev menu you can use, with infinite resources, giving the lanterns more options, and being able to unlock everything whenever you want. In this same vein, I was able to get a 60 FPS cutscene mod, which was nice to throw in the pile. I think the quality of these mods paired with the dedication that exists to create this PC port is something amazing, and I'm excited to see what it leads to in the future. But once again, if you're trying to get this emulator, I do recommend it, and I highly encourage using the resources in the description to help you figure it out, as it's not the easiest process. And if you check out the channel in the upcoming few weeks, you can watch my playthrough/review of Bloodborne itself, and I hope to see you there.